A New Zealand Museum Guide. Chapter 1. New Zealand Museum Websites. Find New Zealand museums at stuff.co.nz, newzealand.com/in/museums, and newzealand.com/in/products/activities/museums-exhibitions. There are articles and lists of New Zealand museums. Stuff.co.nz. newzealand.com/in/museums, newzealand.com/in/products/activities/museums-exhibitions. A list of New Zealand museum websites at dmoz.odp.org/regional/oceania/new_zealand/arts_and_entertainment/museums. kotua.org.nz, Museum of New Zealand. ashburtonmuseum.co.nz, Ashburton Museum, dedicated to history and heritage of the Ashburton district. maritimemuseum.co.nz, New Zealand National Maritime Museum, maritime history including details of historic sailing vessels and steamships. nzmuseums.co.nz, New Zealand Museums, online guide to art galleries and museums in Aotearoa, New Zealand. russellmuseum.org.nz, Russell Museum Te Waredonga o Kororareka, displays include early Maori artifacts, European settlers including model of Cook's ship Endeavour. Te-papa.government.nz, Te Papa Tongarua, Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa takes you inside the New Zealand experience. Warbirdsandwheels.com, Warbirds and Wheels, Wanaka NZ, Classic Car and Warbird Museum, 1950s Retro Diner, History of Local Legend Sir Tim Wallace and NZ Art Collection. wakatanemuseum.org.nz, Wakatane Museum and Research Centre, information on the museum collection and latest exhibitions and events at Te Putua Te Whangaatoi, the Wakatane Library and Exhibition Centre. New Zealand History Museums. aucklandmuseum.com, Auckland Museum, features collections of natural, social, military history and culture related to New Zealand and the South Pacific. Belfast District Museum.co.nz, Belfast District Museum, the museum houses objects from the history of the Belfast District. CambridgeMuseum.org.nz, Cambridge Museum, collection of artifacts, photographs and archives relating to the history of Cambridge, its districts and people. FellMuseum.org.nz, Fell Locomotive Museum, houses H199, one of 6 engines designed for use on New Zealand's famous Rimutaka Incline and the only locomotive of its type in the world. HelensvilleMuseum.org.nz, Helensville Museum, historic and new purpose-built buildings situated on the River Reserve, Mill Road at the southern entrance to the town. MercuryBayMuseum.co.nz, Mercury Bay Museum, opposite the Waishanga Wharf. MorrinsvilleHeritageCentre.org.nz, Morrinsville Museum, features of the museum include the MacDonald Cottage, displays of Maori tools, school items, childhood toys, and dairy farm items. Motati.org.nz, Museum of Transport and Technology, profile, exhibits, opening times and prices. Papakura.museum.org.nz, Papakura Museum, Historical Society, exhibitions and events. PleasantPointTrail.org.nz, Pleasant Point Museum and Railway, fully restored steam trains run between Pleasant Point Keynes Crossing. RotoruaHeritage.co.nz, the living history of Rotorua, settlers and steam museum. SilverdaleMuseum.org.nz, Silverdale Pioneer Village and Gardens, display of buildings from the 1860s to the 1930s and heritage houses. TerraWhitiMuseum.org.nz, Terra Aid Museum, a gateway/wahero and resource for the art, culture, heritage, and the stories of Te Terra Aid. TheTreasury.org.nz, the Treasury, the Oraki Coromandel Research Center and Archive. Waikato Coalfields Museum.weebly.com, Waikato Coalfields Museum, Social and Industrial History. wakatanemuseum.org.nz, Wakatane Museum and Research Center, information on the museum collection and latest exhibitions and events at Te Putua Te Whangaatoi, the Wakatni Library and Exhibition Centre. New Zealand Museum websites. nzmuseums.co.nz, Museums. New Zealand Museums. museums-aotearoa.org.nz, Museums Aotearoa. Historic.org.nz, Heritage Sites in New Zealand. matapihi.org.nz, Matapihi Cultural Organizations. Historic.org.nz, Heritage Sites in New Zealand. ndf.natlib.government.nz, New Zealand National Digital Forum. natlib.government.nz, National Library of New Zealand. museumworkshop.co.nz, Museum Workshop. The Museum Services Directory. airforcemuseum.co.nz, Air Force Museum, Urns of Christchurch. aratoi.co.nz, Aratoi Wairarapa Museum of Art and History. armymuseum.co.nz, Army Museum, Waiauru. arrowtown.org.nz, Arrowtown Village, Lakes District Museum. aucklandartgallery.com, Auckland City Art Gallery. aucklandartgallery.com/library/archives, Auckland City Art Gallery. aucklandmuseum.com, Auckland Museum, Auckland War Memorial Museum, youtube.com/user/Auckland Museum, videos from the Auckland Museum at YouTube. devonportmuseum.org.nz, Devonport Historical and Museum Society. helensvillemuseum.org.nz, Helensville Pioneer Museum. historic.org.nz, Historic Places, Heritage Sites in Auckland. fencible.org.nz, Howick Historical Village. nzmaritime.org, Maritime Museum. motate.org.nz, Motate. Auckland Museum of Transport and Technology. fashionmuseum.org.nz, the New Zealand Fashion Museum. Auckland. Puhoi Historical Society.org.nz, the Puhoi Historical Society. The Puhoi Historical Society records the early history of Puhoi, a settlement created by Bohemian, now Czech Republic, immigrants to New Zealand from the 1860s. navymuseum.mil.nz, the Royal New Zealand Navy Museum. Devonport. nelsoncitycouncil.co.nz/broadgreen-historic-house, Broadgreen. Historic House, Nelson. cambridgemuseum.org.nz, Cambridge Museum. kentmuse.government.nz, Canterbury Museum.artscentre.org.nz, Arts Centre. Christchurch. kentmuse.government.nz, Canterbury Museum. christchurchartgallery.org.nz, Christchurch City Art Gallery. nzmuseums.co.nz, Museum Directory. waymatedc.government.nz/waymate/default/waymate Historical Museum.htm, Waymate Historical Museum and Archives. nzccm.org.nz, New Zealand Conservators of Cultural Materials. tepapa.government.nz/research@tepapa/collection/access/pages/overview.aspx, Museum of New Zealand, Conservation Department. museumworkshop.co.nz, Museum Workshop. dargavillemuseum.co.nz, Dargaville Museum. devonport.co.nz/museum.htm, Devonport Museums, Auckland. otagomuseum.government.nz, Otago Museum, Dunedin. terrawhitimuseum.org.nz, Terra Aid Museum. globalmuseum.org, Global Museum International. waikatomuseum.co.nz, Waikato Museum. fencible.org.nz, Howick Historical Village, Auckland. southlandmuseum.com, Southland Museum and Art Gallery. nzmaritime.org, Maritime Museum, Auckland. New Zealand. National Maritime Museum. motate.org.nz, Motate. Auckland Museum of Transport and Technology. bondstour.co.nz, Museum of Wellington City and Sea. navymuseum.mil.nz, Navy Museum, Devonport. tpapa.government.nz/tpapa/english/national services, national services te payer-ng. tpapa.government.nz/tpapa/english, Museum of New Zealand te Papa Tongarua, in Wellington. pukariki.com, Pukariki. Taranaki Museum and Library. otagomuseum.government.nz, Otago Museum, dunedin.otagomuseum.government.nz/wider_otago.html, North Otago Museum. Library. rugbymuseum.co.nz, the New Zealand Rugby Museum. patika.org.nz, Pataka Museum, Pororua, Wellington. pukariki.com, Pukariki. Taranaki Museum and Library, New. Plymouth.raytihi.tv, Ritahi. Waimarino Museum. Seddon Street. rotoruamuseum.co.nz, Rotorua Museum. buriedvillage.co.nz, the Buried Village, Rotorua. pukariki.com, Taranaki Museum and Library. pukariki.rugbymuseum.co.nz, Rugby Museum, Palmerston North. russellmuseum.org.nz, the Russell Museum, Northland. southlandmuseum.com, Southland Museum and Art Gallery. Invercargill. raytihi.tv, Waimarino Museum. Seddon Street, R. raytihi.tv, Itahi. tpapa.government.nz, te Papa, Wellington. waihimuseum.co.nz, Waihi Museum and Art Gallery. waikatomuseum.org.nz, Waikato Museum of Art and History. Hamilton. waimatedc.government.nz/waimate/default/waimate Historical Museum.htm, Waimate Historical Museum and Archives. aratoi.co.nz, Wairarapa Museum of Art and History, Aratoi. wanganui-museum.org.nz, Wanganui Regional Museum. museumswellington.org.nz/index.php/cable-car-museum, the Cable Car Museum. carterobservatory.org, the Carter Observatory. museumswellington.org.nz/index.php/colonial-cottage-museum, the Colonial Cottage Museum. newdows.org.nz, the Dows Exhibitions, Events, and a Cafe. catherinemansfield.com, Catherine Mansfield House. bondstour.co.nz, Museum of Wellington City and Sea. natlib.government.nz, National Library of New Zealand. nzportraitgallery.org.nz, New Zealand Portrait Gallery. patika.org.nz, Pataka Museum, Pororua, Wellington. piatonesettlers.org.nz, Petone Settlers Museum. tpapa.government.nz, te Papa Wellington. wmt.org.nz, Wellington Museums Trust. whangareiartmuseum.co.nz, Whangarei Art Museum. Prison Museums in New Zealand. Napier Prison. Chapter 2. A list of New Zealand museums and websites at museumsaotroa.org.nz/about/membership/member-organizations. A Gantai Art Gallery. Museum. Canterbury. timaru.government.nz/art-gallery. Air Force Museum of New Zealand. Museum. Canterbury. airforcemuseum.co.nz. A Caro Museum. Museum. Canterbury. acaroamuseum.org.nz. Albert Land Heritage Centre. Museum. Auckland. albertlandmuseum.co.nz. Alberton. Museum. Auckland. heritage.org.nz. Alexander Turnbull Library. National Organization. Wellington. natlib.government.nz. Anderson Design Ltd. Service listing. Wellington. andersondesign.co.nz. Aotea Utanganui Museum of South Taranaki. Museum. Taranaki. Museum of South Taranaki.wordpress.com. Aratoi Wairarapa Museum of Art and History. Museum. Wellington. aratoi.org.nz. Ashburton Art Gallery and Museum. Museum. Canterbury. ashburtonartgallery.org.nz. Ashley and Associates. Service listing. Auckland. ashley-associates.co.nz. Auckland War Memorial Museum. Museum. Auckland. aucklandmuseum.com. Bank of New Zealand Heritage, Museum, Archives and Art Collection. Online. Wellington. bnzheritage.co.nz. Butler Point Whaling Museum. Museum. Northland. butlerpoint.co.nz. Cambridge Museum. Museum. Waikato. cambridgemuseum.org.nz. Campbell Conservation. Service listing. Canterbury. campbellconservation.co.nz. Canterbury Museum. Museum. Canterbury. canterburymuseum.com. Central Hawke's Bay Museum. Museum. Hawke's Bay. chbsettlersmuseum.co.nz. Central Stories Museum and Art Gallery. Museum. Otago. Christchurch Art Gallery Te Puna Owaiwatu. Museum. Canterbury. christchurchartgallery.org.nz. Clapham's National Clock Museum. Museum. Northland. claphamsclocks.com. Click Suite. Service listing. Wellington. clicksuite.co.nz. Coach House Museum. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. coachhousemuseum.nz. Coal Town Museum. Museum. West Coast. coaltown.co.nz. Cobblestones Museum. Museum. Wellington. cobblestonesmuseum.org.nz. Conservation Supplies. Service listing. Hawke's Bay. conservationsupplies.co.nz. Cotter Medical Museum. Museum. Canterbury. cottermuseum.co.nz. Cowaldray House. Museum. Auckland. codrayhouse.org.nz/historic. Cromwell Museum. Museum. Otago. cromwellmuseum.nz. Dannevirke Gallery of History. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. facebook.com/Dannevirke Museum/about. Dargaville Museum Te Hware Donga Otunadahi. Museum. Northland. dargavillemuseum.co.nz. Diana Coop Conservation. Service Provider. paperconservation.co.nz. Driving Creek Railway, Arts and Conservation Trust. Museum. Waikato. dcrail.nz. Dunedin Public Art Gallery. Museum. Otago. Dunedin.art.museum. East Coast Museum of Technology. Museum. Gisborne. ecmot.org.nz. Edwin Fox Maritime Centre. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. Ikitahuna and District's Early Settlers Museum. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. Engineer Corps Memorial Centre. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. Experience Wellington. Museum. Wellington. experiencewellington.org.nz. Forester Gallery. Museum. Otago. culturewaitaki.org.nz/forester-gallery. Founders Heritage Park. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. Founderspark.co.nz. Geraldine Vintage Car and Machinery Museum. Canterbury. Gibson Group. Service listing. Wellington. Gibson.co.nz. Golden Bay Museum Te Wakahuia Omahawa. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. goldenbaymuseum.org.nz. Gore Historical Museum. Museum. Southland. gorenz.com/visit/arts-and-culture. Gavitt Brewster Art Gallery. Museum. Taranaki. gavittbrewster.com. Havelock Museum Society. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. polorispeople.org.nz/Havelock Museum. Hitohu, National Library of New Zealand. Wellington. natlib.government.nz/he-tohu. Helensville Museum. Museum. Auckland. helensvillemuseum.org.nz. Heritage New Zealand Po'er Donga. National Organizations. Wellington. heritage.org.nz. Hillsborough Holden Museum. Museum. hillsborough-holden-museum.co.nz. History House Museum. Museum. West Coast. Hawken Collections. Museum. Otago. otago.ac.nz/Hawken. Hokitika Museum. Museum. West Coast. hokitika-museum.co.nz. Hokanui Moonshine Museum. Museum. Southland. Howick Historical Village. Museum. Auckland. fencible.org.nz. Interpretation Network New Zealand. National Organizations. nz.net.nz. Invercargill Public Art Gallery. Museum. Southland. Invercargill Public Art Gallery.nz. Journeys End Cottage and Leshley House and Block House. Museum. Auckland. Kaikoura Museum. Museum. Canterbury. kaikoura-museum.co.nz. Kapatai Coast Museum. Museum. Wellington. kapataicoastmuseum.org.nz. Catherine Mansfield House and Garden. Museum. Wellington. catherinemansfield.com. Kendurton Electrical Ltd. Service listing. Auckland. kelpeles.co.nz. Lakes District Museum. Museum. Otago. museumqueenstown.com. Lysotwat Gallery. Museum. Taranaki. lysotwatgallery.co.nz. Mahara Gallery. Museum. Wellington. maharagallery.org.nz. Mangahe Museum. Museum. Northland. mangawhai-museum.org.nz. Marlborough Museum. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. marlboroughmuseum.org.nz. Matamata Historical Society. Museum. Waikato. Mataora Museum. Museum. Southland. nzmuseums.co.nz/account/4033. Mercury Bay Museum. Museum. Waikato. mercurybaymuseum.co.nz. Millennium Public Art Gallery. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. marlboroughart.org.nz. Milton Museum and Information Center, Tokomariro Historical Society. Museum. Otago. Ngau Museum. Museum. Taranaki. mokuumuseum.nz. Motueka District Museum. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. motueka districtmuseum.org.nz. MTG Hawke's Bay Museum. Hawke's Bay. mtghawksbay.com. Murchison Museum. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. Museum Education Association of New Zealand. National Organizations. Auckland. Museum of Audio-Visual Technology. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarua. Museum. Wellington. tepapa.government.nz. Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarua. Museum. Wellington. tepapa.government.nz. Museum of Transport and Technology, Motate. Museum. Auckland. motat.org.nz. National Army Museum Te Matatoa. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. armymuseum.co.nz. National Library of New Zealand, and Alexander Turnbull Library. Museum. natlib.government.nz. National Museum of the Royal New Zealand Navy. Museum. Auckland. navymuseum.co.nz. National Railway Museum of NZ. Museum. Canterbury. nzrailmuseum.com. National Transport and Toy Museum. Museum. Otago. nttmuseum.co.nz. Neil Partington Design Service Provider. Wellington. neilpartington.com. Nelson Provincial Museum Pupuri Donga Ote Taiao. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. nelsonmuseum.co.nz. New Zealand Conservators of Cultural Material Pu Manaki Kahurangi. National Organizations. Auckland. nzccm.org.nz. New Zealand Cultural Heritage Charitable Trust. Museum. Otago. New Zealand Maritime Museum. Museum. Auckland. maritimemuseum.co.nz. New Zealand Police Museum. Museum. Wellington. police.government.nz/museum. New Zealand Portrait Gallery. Museum. Wellington. nzportraitgallery.org.nz. New Zealand Rugby Museum. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. rugbymuseum.co.nz. Northland Society of Arts, Inc. Museum. Northland. rayburnhouse.co.nz. O'Kane's Bay Mori and Colonial Museum. Museum. Canterbury. O'Kane's Bay Museum.co.nz. Omaka Aviation Heritage Centre. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. omaka.org.nz. Otago Museum. Museum. Otago. otagomuseum.nz. Taki Museum. Museum. Wellington. Oaka Museum, Wahika. Museum. Otago. owakamuseum.org.nz. Papakura Museum. Museum. Auckland. papakuramuseum.org.nz. Parliamentary Precinct. Museum. Wellington. parliament.nz/n-nz. Teika Art and Museum. Museum. Wellington. patika.org.nz. Percy Thompson Gallery. Museum. Taranaki. percythompsongallery.org.nz. Picton Heritage and Whaling Museum. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. Pioneer Village Kaikahi. Museum. Northland. pioneervillage.org.nz. Port Chalmers Maritime Museum. Museum. Otago. portmuseum.org.nz. Port Mapua Maritime Museum. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. mapuawharf.co.nz/businesses/2018/11/15/mapua-boat-club-amp-maritime-museum. Pukariki Museum. Taranaki. Pukariki.com. Raglan and District Museum Society. Museum. Waikato. raglanmuseum.co.nz. Rotorua Museum Te Hware Donga o Te Arawa. Museum. Bay of Plenty. rotoruamuseum.co.nz. Russell Museum, Te Hware Donga o Kororika. Museum. Northland. russellmuseum.org.nz. Shantytown Heritage Park. Museum. West Coast. shantytown.co.nz. Sir James Fletcher Kawarau Museum. Museum. Bay of Plenty. karodc.government.nz/services/museum. South Canterbury Museum. Museum. Canterbury. museum.timaru.government.nz. South Otago Museum. Museum. Otago. Southland Museum and Art Gallery. Museum. Southland. southlandmuseum.co.nz. St. John Archive, Northern Region. Museum. Auckland. stjohn.org.nz. Stewart Island Reikira Museum. Museum. Southland. Switzer's Museum, Waikaya, Inc. Museum. Te Waiti Museum Te Hware Donga o Te Waiti. Museum. Gisborne. tarawhitimuseum.org.nz. Taranaki Pioneer Village. Museum. Taranaki. pioneervillage.co.nz. Toe Museum. Museum. Waikato. Tornga Art Gallery. Museum. Bay of Plenty. artgallery.org.nz. Tornga Museum and Exhibition Center. Museum. Bay of Plenty. Tauranga Heritage Collection.co.nz. Te Ahu Heritage Museum. Museum. Northland. tiau.org.nz. Te Aroha and District Museum Society Inc. Museum. Waikato. tirohamuseum.com. Te Awahanui Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. twaho.com. Te Awamuto Museum. Museum. Waikato. tamuseum.org.nz. Te Putua Te Wanga Atoi Wakatni Library and Exhibition Center. Museum. Bay of Plenty. wakatanemuseum.org.nz. wakatanemuseum.org.nz. Te Manawa. Museum. Manawatu Wanganui. Te manawa.co.nz. Te Toyuku, Crown Lin and Clay Works Museum. Museum. Auckland. tetoiuku.org.nz. Te Tuai. Museum. Auckland. tetuhai.org.nz. Te Akatha Littleton Museum. Museum. Canterbury. teuaka.org.nz. The Cowrie Museum. Museum. Northland. kauri-museum.com. The Pa Homestead, TSB Bank Wallace Arts Centre. Museum. Auckland. wallaceartstrust.org.nz. The Suter Art Gallery Te Aratoi Owakat. Museum. Tasman/Nelson/Marlborough. thesuter.org.nz. Timber Museum of New Zealand. Museum. Waikato. nztimbermuseum.co.nz. Totara Estate. Museum. Otago. heritage.org.nz. Tramway Historical Society. Museum. Canterbury. ferrymeadtramway.org.nz. TSB Bank Bowls New Zealand Museum. Museum. Taranaki. University of Waikato Art Collection. Museum. Waikato. waikato.ac.nz/academy/gallery. Way Community Art Gallery. Museum. Auckland. wayhekartgallery.org.nz. Way I Arts Centre and Museum. Museum. Waikato. wayhimuseum.co.nz. Waikato Coalfields Museum. Museum. Waikato. coal.net.nz. Waikato Museum Te Waredonga o Waikato. Museum. Waikato. waikatomuseum.co.nz. Weymouth Museum and Archives. Museum. Canterbury. Weymouth Museum and Archives.org.nz. Waipa Scottish Migration Museum. Museum. Northland. waypumuseum.com. Wairoa Museum. Museum. Hawke's Bay. facebook.com/Wairoa Museum. Waitaki Museum and Archive Te Waredaka o Waitaki. Museum. Otago. culturewaitaki.org.nz/north-otago-museum. Waitangi National Trust. Museum. Northland. waitangi.org.nz. Waitomo Caves Discovery Center, Museum of Caves. Museum. Waikato. waitomodiscovery.org. Waihoku Museum Society. Museum. Auckland. Wallace Gallery Morrinsville. Museum. morrinsvillelegally.org.nz. Warkworth and District Museum. Museum. Auckland. warkworthmuseum.co.nz. Western Bay Museum. Museum. Bay of Plenty. westernbaymuseum.nz. Hwangarei Art Museum, Te Manawatoi. Museum. Northland. Whangarei Art Museum.co.nz. Hwangarei Museum, Kiwi North. Museum. Northland. kiwinorth.co.nz. Waranaki Waredonga. Museum. Wellington. warinakiarts.org.nz. Wyndham Park Heritage Centre. Museum. Southland. Chapter 3. A list of New Zealand museums in alphabetical order at en.wikipedia.org/wiki/list_of_museums_in_new_Zealand. Adam Art Gallery. Wellington. Art Gallery. Air Force Museum of New Zealand. Wigram. Christchurch. Canterbury. Military Museum. Agantai Art Gallery. Timaru. Canterbury. Art Gallery. Albert Land Heritage Museum. Welsford. Rodney. Auckland. Local Museum. Aotea Utanganui, Museum of South Taranaki. Paeta. South Taranaki. Taranaki. Local Museum. Aratoi Wairarapa Museum of Art and History. Masterton. Wellington. Art Gallery. Art Space Aotearoa. Auckland CBD. Waitemata. Auckland. Art Gallery. Auckland Art Gallery Toyotamaki. Auckland CBD. Waitemata. Auckland. Art Gallery. Auckland War Memorial Museum. Parnell. Waitemata. Auckland. Regional Museum. Blue Oyster Art Projects Space. Central Dunedin. Dunedin. Otago. Art Gallery. Bluff Maritime Museum. Bluff. Invercargill. Southland. Maritime Museum. Butler Point Whaling Museum. Hi. Far North. Northland. Specialist Museum. Dunedin Central. Dunedin. Otago. Specialist Museum. Canterbury Museum. Christchurch CBD. Christchurch. Canterbury. Regional Museum. Carditon Railway Museum, Te Hware Rare We O Carditon. 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 Wellington. Railway Museum. Centre of Contemporary Art. Christchurch Central. Christchurch. Canterbury. Art Gallery. Christchurch Art Gallery Te Puna Owewatu. Christchurch Central. Christchurch. Canterbury. Art Gallery. City Gallery Wellington. Wellington Central. Wellington. Art Gallery. Classic Flyers Museum. Mount Maunganui. Tornga. Bay of Plenty. Car Museum. Coal Town Museum. Westport. Buller. West Coast. Local Museum. Cobblestones Museum. Greytown. South Wairarapa. Wellington. Historic Village. Nairn Street Cottage. Mount Cook. Wellington. Local Museum. Corbon Estate Arts Centre. Henderson. Henderson Massey. Auckland. Art Gallery. Crystal Mountain Mine Museum. Swanson. Waitara Ranges. Auckland. Specialist Museum. Dalmatian Archives and Museum. Auckland CBD. Waitemata. Auckland. Specialist Museum. Devonport Museum. Devonport. Devonport Takapuna. Auckland. Local Museum. The Dow's Art Museum. Hutt Central. Lower Hutt. Wellington. Art Gallery. Dunedin Gasworks Museum. Dunedin South. Dunedin. Otago. Historic Gasworks. Dunedin Public Art Gallery. Central Dunedin. Dunedin. Otago. Art Gallery. Eastern Southland Gallery. Gore. Southland. Art Gallery. Edwin Fox Maritime Centre. Picton. Marlborough. Maritime Museum. Enjoy Contemporary Art Space. Wellington. Art Gallery. Fell Engine Museum. Featherston. South Wairarapa. Wellington. Rail Museum. Ferrymead Heritage Park. Ferrymead. Christchurch. Canterbury. Historic Village. Flax Stripper Museum. Foxton. Hirohenua. Manawat Wanganui. Local Museum. Foxton Museum. Foxton. Hirohenua. Manawat Wanganui. Local Museum. Founders Heritage Park. The Wood. Nelson. Local Museum. Gibbs Farm. Makarau. Rodney. Auckland. Sculpture Farm. Glenbrook Vintage Railway. Waihoku. Franklin. Auckland. Heritage Railway. Golden Bay Museum. Tikaka. Tasman. Local Museum. Govett Brewster Art Gallery. New Plymouth Central. New Plymouth. Taranaki. Art Gallery. Gus Fisher Gallery. Auckland CBD. Waitemata. Auckland. Art Gallery. Hastings City Art Gallery. Hastings Central. Hastings. Hawke's Bay. Art Gallery. Highwick. Epsom. Albert Eden. Auckland. Heritage Building. Hawken Collections. Dunedin Central. Dunedin. Otago. Art Gallery. Howick Historical Village. Pakuranga. Howick. Auckland. Heritage Village. Hokitika Museum. Hokitika. Westland. West Coast. Local Museum. Hwea Settlers Museum. Hwea. Waitara Ranges. Auckland. Local Museum. Hundertwasser Arts Centre and Wairamori Art Gallery. Whangarei Central. Hwangarae, Northland. Art Gallery. Johnsonian Institute. Hwea. Waitkara Ranges. Auckland. Specialist Museum. Catherine Mansfield Birthplace. Thornton. Wellington. Historic Building. Cowrie Museum. Matakahi. Kaipara. Northland. Local Museum. Larnach Castle. Pukiki. Dunedin. Otago. Historic Building. Len Lai Centre. New Plymouth Central. New Plymouth. Taranaki. Art Gallery. Mahara Gallery. Waikani. Kapatai Coast. Wellington. Art Gallery. Mangahe Museum. Mangahe. Kaipara. Northland. Local Museum. Mansion House. Warkworth. Rodney. Auckland. Historic Building. Museum of Transport and Technology. Western Springs. Waitemata. Auckland. Technology Museum. Museum of Waiak. Onetangi. Waiak Island. Auckland. Local Museum. McKayan House. Titirangi. Waitkara Ranges. Auckland. Historic Building. Mission House/Stone Store. Kerikeri. Far North. Northland. Historic Building. MTG Hawke's Bay. Central Napier. Napier. Hawke's Bay. Regional Museum. Napier Prison. Bluff Hill. Napier. Hawke's Bay. Historic Building. National Army Museum. Waiauru. Ruapehu. Manawat Huanganui. Military Museum. National Museum of Audio-Visual Arts and Sciences. Foxton. Hirohenua. Manawat Huanganui. Technology Museum. National Tattoo Museum of New Zealand. Te Arrow. Wellington. Specialist Museum. Nelson Provincial Museum. Nelson Central. Nelson. Regional Museum. New Zealand Cricket Museum. Mount Cook. Wellington. Sports Museum. New Zealand Maritime Museum. Auckland CBD. Waitemata. Auckland. Maritime Museum. New Zealand Portrait Gallery. Pipitea. 155. Wellington. Art Gallery. New Zealand Rugby Museum. Palmerston North Central. Palmerston North. Manawat Huanganui. Sports Museum. New Zealand Sports Hall of Fame. Central Dunedin. Dunedin. Otago. Sports Museum. New Zealand Timber Museum. Litchfield. South Waikato. Waikato. Specialist Museum. New Zealand Trotting Hall of Fame. Epsom. Albert Eden. Auckland. Racing Museum. NGA with Macron Donga Sound and Vision. Thornton. Wellington. Archive. Objects Space. Grey Lynn. Waitemata. Auckland. Art Gallery. Alveston. Dunedin North. Dunedin. Otago. Heritage Building. Omaka Aviation Heritage Centre. Blenheim. Marlborough. Aviation Museum. Opatiki Heritage and Agricultural Society. Tiki. Bay of Plenty. Local Museum. Oratia Folk Museum. Oratia. Waitkara Ranges. Auckland. Local Museum. Otago Museum. Dunedin Central. Dunedin. Otago. Regional Museum. Otaka Museum. Taki. Kapatai Coast. Wellington. Local Museum. Polish Heritage Trust Museum. Howick. Auckland. Specialist Museum. Padiachua and Districts Museum. Padiachua. Tararua. Manawat Huanganui. Local Museum. Padiachua Railcar Society. Padiachua. Tararua. Manawat Huanganui. Local Museum. Papakara Museum. Papakara. Howick. Auckland. Local Museum. Pataka Art and Museum. Pororua Central. Pororua. Wellington. Art Gallery, Local Museum. Papatoeto Historical Society. Papatoeto. Tara Papatoeto. Auckland. Local Museum. The Physics Room. Christchurch Central. Christchurch. Canterbury. Art Gallery. The Plains Vintage Railway and Historical Museum. Tynwald. Ashburton. Canterbury. Heritage Railway. Pleasant Point Museum and Railway. Pleasant Point. Timaru. Canterbury. Railway Museum. Pompalier House. Russell. Far North. Northland. Heritage Building. Port Chalmers Maritime Museum. Port Chalmers. Dunedin. Otago. Maritime Museum. Pukeariki. New Plymouth Central. New Plymouth. Taranaki. Regional Museum. Ravenska House Museum. Christchurch CBD. Christchurch. Canterbury. Art Gallery. Rodero Island Museum. Rodero Island. Wake Island. Auckland. Local Museum. Rotorua Museum. Rotorua Central. Rotorua Lakes. Bay of Plenty. Local Museum. Reserve Bank Museum. Wellington Central. Wellington. Specialist Museum. Rayburn House Art Gallery. Whangarei Central. Whangarei District. Northland. Art Gallery. Sargent Gallery. Whanganui Central. Whanganui. Manawat Whanganui. Art Gallery. St. Paul Saint Gallery. Auckland CBD. Waitemata. Auckland. Art Gallery. Shantytown. Perot. Grey. West Coast. Heritage Village. Steampunk HQ. Oamaru. Waitaki. Otago. Art Gallery. Southland Museum and Art Gallery. Invercargill Central. Invercargill. Southland. Regional Museum. South Canterbury Museum. Timaru. Timaru. Canterbury. Local Museum. Southward Car Museum. Otahanga. Kapatai Coast. Wellington. Car Museum. Space Place at Carter Observatory. Kelburn. Wellington. Observatory. The Suter Art Gallery. Nelson Central. Nelson. Art Gallery. Terae ID Museum. Huatapoko. Gisborne. Local Museum. Toe Museum. Toe Central. Toe. Waikato. Local Museum. Tornga Art Gallery. Tornga Central. Tornga. Bay of Plenty. Art Gallery. Te Awahanua Foxton. Hirohenua. Manawat Whanganui. Local Museum. Te Ngahu Museum of Waitangi. Waitangi. Far North. Northland. National Museum. Te Manawa. Palmerston North Central. Palmerston North. Manawat Whanganui. Regional Museum. Te Papa. Wellington Central. Wellington. National Museum. Te Puia. Wakarwerwa. Rotorua Lakes. Bay of Plenty. Specialist Museum. Te Raaroha Museum. Waitangi. Far North. Northland. National Museum. Te Tuai. Pakuranga. Howick. Auckland. Art Gallery. Teuru Waitkura Contemporary Gallery. Te Tirangi. Waitkura Ranges. Auckland. Art Gallery. Te Weymouth Mission. Weymouth North. Far North. Northland. Historic Building. Te Wairoa. Lake Taraira. Rotorua. Bay of Plenty. Historic Village. Toi Otago Settlers Museum. Dunedin Central. Dunedin. Otago. Regional Museum. Torpedo Bay Navy Museum. Devonport. Devonport Takapuna. Auckland. Maritime Museum, Military Museum. Treaty House. Waitangi. Far North. Northland. National Museum. Uxbridge Art Gallery. Mellons Bay. Howick. Auckland. Art Gallery. Waikato Museum Te Waredonga o Waikato. Hamilton Central. Hamilton. Waikato. Regional Museum. Waimarino Museum. Ridahi. Ruapehu. Manawat Huanganui. Local Museum. Waitangi Treaty Grounds. Waitangi. Far North. Northland. Historic Site. Waitamo Caves Museum. Waitamo. Waitamo. Waikato. Local Museum. Waihoku Museum. Waihoku. Franklin. Auckland. Local Museum. Warkworth Museum. Warkworth. Rodney. Auckland. Local Museum. Wellington Museum. Wellington Central. Wellington. Regional Museum. Wellington Tramway Museum. Paraparamu. Kapatai Coast. Wellington. Rail Museum. Wakatni Museum. Wakatni. Wakatni. Bay of Plenty. Local Museum. Huanganui Regional Museum. Huanganui Central. Huanganui. Manawat Huanganui. Regional Museum. Huangarai Art Museum Te Manawatoi. Huangarai Central. Huangarai. Northland. Art Gallery. Huangarai Museum. Manu. Huangarai. Northland. Local Museum. Whitaker's Music Museum. Honoro. Wake Island. Auckland. Specialist Museum. Yaldhurst Museum. Yaldhurst. Christchurch. Canterbury. Chapter 4. Several hundred art galleries, museums, and historic sites listed at kotwia.org.nz/visit. Go on kotwia.org.nz/visit. Click on any of the places listed there to get more info about that place. Academy Galleries. A Gantai Art Gallery. Air Force Museum of New Zealand. A Caro Museum Te Waredonga. Albert Land Heritage Museum Inc. Alberton. Amuri Historical Society Inc. Aotea Utanganui Museum of South Taranaki. Aratoi Wairarapa Museum of Art and History. Archive of Maury and Pacific Sound. Art Deco Trust, Napier. Arthur's Pass Alpine Museum. Arts Centre of Christchurch. Arts Space. Arts Post. Art Station. Ashburton Art Gallery. Ashburton Museum. Ashburton Aviation Museum. Athenry Homestead. Auckland War Memorial Museum. Auckland Art Gallery Toi Otamaki. Auckland Catholic Diocesan Archives. Auckland Fire Brigades Museum and Historical Society Inc. Awerua Communications Museum Inc. Belfast District Museum. Bill Richardson Transport World. Bishop's School. Blue Oyster Art Projects Space. Bluff Maritime Museum. Brain Watkins House Museum, EST 1881. Broad Green House. Brunner Mine Site. Bowls Museum. Buried Village incorporating the Museum of Te Wairoa. Butler Point Whaling Museum and 1840s House. Cambridge Museum. Canterbury Museum. Canterbury Centre for Historic Photography and Film. Capital E, for Children. Cardigan District Historical Society Inc. Central and Western Murihiko Southland Archive. Central Stories Museum and Art Gallery. Centre of Contemporary Art, Coca. Charlotte Museum Trust. Chatham Islands Museum. CHB Museum. Cheviot Historical Society Museum. Christchurch Art Gallery Te Puna Awewit. City Gallery Wellington. Clatham's Clocks. Classic Flyers. Classic Motorcycle Mecca. Classics Museum. Clendon House. Clyde Stationary Engine Museum Inc. Clyde Historical Museum. Coal Town Museum. Cobblestones Wairarapa Regional Settlers Museum. Commemorative Air Force South Pacific Wing. Coromandel School of Mines and Historical Museum. Cotter Medical History Museum. Cowldray House. Cromwell Museum. Dalmatian Archive and Museum. Dannevirke Gallery of History, Inc. Dargaville Museum. Devonport Historical and Museum Society Inc. Driving Creek Railway and Potteries. Duart House. Dunedin Public Art Gallery. Dunedin Gasworks Museum. East Coast Museum of Technology. Eastern Southland Gallery. Eco World Aquarium and Wildlife Rehabilitation Centre. Edwin Fox Ship and Maritime Centre. Ekatahuna and District's Early Settlers Museum Society. Elvis Presley Memorial Record Room, Private Museum. Enjoy Contemporary Art Space. Ernest and Marion Davis Library. Awelma Cottage. Expressions Arts and Entertainment Centre. Faraday Museum of Technology. Featherston Heritage Museum. Fell Locomotive Museum. Ferrymead Heritage Park. Ferrymead Railway. Fire Brigades Men's Museum. Firth Tower Museum. Flaxbourne Settlers Museum. Founders Heritage Park. Foxton Historical Society Museum. Foxton Flax Stripper Museum. Funho. National Toy Museum. Fife House. Geological Collections, The University of Auckland. Geraldine Vintage Car and Machinery Museum. Geraldine Historical Society Museum. Girl Museum. Glasstime Glass Museum. Glenbrook Vintage Railway. Glen Tunnel Museum, Canterbury, New Zealand. Golden Bay Museum, Te Wakahuia Omahawa. Golder Cottage. Gold Mine Experience. Gore Historical Museum. Gore Air Force Museum. Govett Brewster Art Gallery. Gus Fisher Gallery. Gypsy Rose Tea Museum. Harbour and Tyne Historic Precinct. Hastings City Art Gallery. Havelock Museum, Marlborough. Hayes Engineering Works. Helensville Museum. Henderson Mill Cottage. Higgins Heritage Park Inc. High Wyck. Hakarangi Historical Museum. Historic Fort Te Arrow. Hawken Collections Uardika Ohana. Hokianga Museum. Hokitika Museum. Hokanui Pioneer Village and Museum. Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. Homebush Museum. Hororata Museum. Howick Historical Village. Hunterville and District Settlers Museum. Huntley Museum / Te Huaredonga o Rawipuka. Hewerworth Cottage. Inangawa Local History Display. Invercargill Public Art Gallery. Isle House. Jack Morgan Museum. Johnsonian Institute. Kahutera Taxidermy Gallery. Kaiapoi Museum. Kaikoura Museum. Kaparoro Historic House Museum. Kapatai Coast Museum. Karamia Centennial Museum. Catherine Mansfield House and Garden. Kawakawa Memorial Library Center. Kuia Regional Museum Gallery, Te Huaredonga o Kuia Moana. Kemp House and Stone Store. Kiwi North, Hwangari Museum, Kiwi House and Heritage Park. Kawa Archives Society. Lakes District Museum and Gallery. Larnach Castle. Left Bank Art Gallery. Lilia's Lace Collection. Lincoln and Districts Historical Society, Inc. Luttrell's White Pine Gardens and Working Pioneer Museum. Littleton Museum. Littleton Time Ball Station. Mahara Gallery. Mainline Steam Heritage Trust. Mangahe Museum. Manjari Historical Society. Manjari Mountain Education Center. Mangungu Mission House. Maniato Early Settlers Museum and Jubilee Museum. Mansion House. Marlborough Provincial Museum and Archives. Martinborough Colonial Museum. Martin Historical Village. Masonic Museum of United Masters Lodge No. 167. Massey University Art Collection. Mataora Museum. McKayan House. McNichol Homestead. Mercury Bay Museum. Methodist Church of New Zealand Archives. Middlemarch Museum. Millennium Public Art Gallery. Moko Museum. Morrinsville Museum. Motueka District Museum. MTG Hawke's Bay, Museum Theatre Gallery. Murchison Museum. Museum of Childhood. Museum of Transport and Technology, Motate. Museum of Woodwork, Ornamental Turning and Tools. Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarua. Museums of Central Otago. Nairn Street Cottage. National Scout Museum. National Paleontological Research Collections, GNS Science. National Library Gallery. National Transport and Toy Museum. National Army Museum Te Matatoa. National Services Te Paerangi. Nelson Provincial Museum. Nelson Classic Car Museum. New Zealand Railway and Locomotive Society Inc. New Zealand Centre for Photography. New Zealand Trotting Hall of Fame Inc. New Zealand Portrait Gallery Te Pkagia Wakata. New Zealand Warbirds at Ardmore. New Zealand Sports Hall of Fame. New Zealand Marine Studies Centre. New Zealand Police Museum. New Zealand Arthropod Collection. New Zealand Beerkin Museum. New Zealand Cartoon Archive. New Zealand Maritime Museum Hawaii Te Ananuia Tangaro. New Zealand Rugby Museum. New Zealand Cricket Museum. New Zealand Fashion Museum. NGA with Macron Donga Sound and Vision. Norsewood Pioneer Cottage Museum. Northbrook Museum. Northern Buller Museum, Granity. Northland Firehouse Museum. Northland Medical Museum. NZ Alpine and Agriculture Encounter. Ocean Beach Railway. O'Kane's Bay Museum. Old St. Paul's. Old Cromwell Town. Alveston Historic Home. Omaka Aviation Heritage Center. Onehunga Fencible and Historical Society Inc. Ophir Post Office. Opatiki Heritage and Agricultural Society. Oratia Folk Museum. Ormondville Railway Station. Otago Museum. Otago Art Society Inc. Otago Peninsula Museum and Historical Society. Otahuhu Historical Society. Otaka Museum. Otata Museum. Otora Hanga Kiwi House and Native Bird Park. Tora Hanga Museum. Our Health Journeys E-Museum. Oaka Museum and Catlands Information Centre Wahi Kawika, the meeting place a rest on your journey. Oxford Museum. Packard Motor Museum. Paikakariki Station Museum. Paro Historical Maritime Park. Padiachua and Districts Museum Society Inc. Papakara Museum. Papadoato Historical Society. Pataka Museum of Arts and Cultures. Percy Thompson Gallery. Patone Settlers Museum Te Hware Wakaro Opita 1. Pioneer Village Kaikahi. Pioneer Hall. Parangia Heritage and Information Center Te Hware Donga Onga Royo Erka Honora Inc. Pleasant Point Museum and Railway. Polish Heritage Trust Museum, Pompallier Mission, Pororua Hospital Museum, Port Chalmers Maritime Museum, Private Garden, Pohoi Heritage Museum Incorporated, Pukeariki, Pukekahi Pioneer Cottage, Raglan and District Museum / Te Huare Donga Owangaro, Railway Enthusiasts Society, Rekiura Museum, Rangirura Girls School Archives, Rangiora and Districts Early Records Society Inc., Rangerary Heritage Center, Ruas Village, Riverboat Museum and Paddle Steamer Waimari, Rotorua RSA Museum, Rotorua Museum Te Huare Donga o Te Arawa, Royal New Zealand Navy Museum, Royal New Zealand Army Medical Corps Museum, Russell Museum Te Huare Donga o Kororarika, Sargent Gallery / Te Huare o Rihua / Huanganui, Shantytown Heritage Park, Silky Oak, Silver Stream Railway, Silverdale Pioneer Village, Sir James Fletcher Kawarau Museum, South Canterbury Aviation Heritage Centre, South Canterbury Museum, South Otago Museum, Southland Fire Service Museum Society Inc., Southland Museum and Art Gallery, Space Place at Carter Observatory, Sports and Vintage Aviation Society, St. Margaret's College Archives, St. Paul Street Gallery, St. Andrews College Museum, Steam Scene, Steam Incorporated, Switzer's Museum, Waikaya, Inc., Teari Historical Museum, Tehupi and District Museum and Historical Society, Terwaiti Museum, Tapuaka, Heritage and Archive Collections, Taranaki Aviation Transport and Technology Museum Inc., Taranaki Pioneer Village, Taupo Museum, Tornga Heritage Collection, Tornga Art Gallery, Tornga Village Radio Museum Inc., Ta'iti Museum, Te Awahanyaweestrum, Te Takatoy Adam Art Gallery, Te Rua Mahara o Te Kwanatanga, Archives New Zealand, Te Toyuku, Te Amorangi Trust Museum Inc., Te Kitty Museum and Gallery, Te Uru Waitakere Contemporary Gallery, Te Waimit Mission, Te Manawa, Te Ahu Museum and Archives, Te Aroha and Districts Museum, Te Tuai, Te Awamuto Museum, Te Huarataka o Waitaki / Waitaki Museum and Archive, Te Haikoi Museum, Tees Museum of Classical Antiquities, Templeton Flax Mill Heritage Museum, Teviot District Museum, Thames School of Mines and Mineralogical Museum, Thames Museum Te Huare Donga o Te Koaranga, the Medical Museum, the Printing Museum, the Plains Vintage Railway and Historical Museum, the Elms Mission House, the Physics Room, the Wellington Fire Museum Trust, the Coach House Museum, Fielding's Home of Rural Stories, the Arts House Trust, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Museum, the Dow's Art Museum, the New Brighton and Districts Historical Society and Museum Inc., the Poynton Collection, the Wool Shed, National Museum of Sheep and Shearing, the National Museum of Audio-Visual Arts and Sciences of NZ Trust Inc., the Forester Gallery, the Huia Settlers Museum, the Kauri Museum, Matakahi, the Timber Museum of New Zealand Trust, the Treasury Research Centre and Archive, the Suter Te Aratoi Awakat, the University of Waikato Art Collection and Gallagher Academy of Performing Arts, the Medical Museum Palmerston North, the Film Poster Gallery, the Garrison HQ, the National Tattoo Museum of New Zealand, Thornbury Vintage Tractor Club, Timaru Boys High School Memorial Library, Taira Museum, Toit Otago Settlers Museum, Tokomariro Historical Society, Tokomaru Steam Engine Museum, Tongariro National Trout Center, Torpedo Boat Museum, Totara Estate, Tramway Historical Society Inc., TSB Bank Bowls New Zealand Museum. Twaco and District Museum Society Inc. Twapeka Goldfields Museum. Thura Otago Community Trust Science Centre. University of Canterbury, Canterbury College Collection. Uxbridge, Howick's Creative Centre. Victoria University of Wellington Classics Museum. Villa Maria College. Waihe Musical Museum founded by Lloyd and Joan Whittaker. Waihe Island Historic Museum. Waihe Arts Centre and Museum Association, Inc. Waikato Museum Te Wairaranga o Waikato. Waikato Health Memorabilia Trust. Waikawa Museum. Waikouaiti Coast Heritage Centre. Waimate Museum and Archives. Wainewiomata Historical Museum. Wainewiomata Water Museum. Waipa Migration Museum. Wairoa District Museum. Waitangi Treaty Grounds. Waitamo Caves Discovery Centre. Waihoku Museum. Warkworth and District Museum. Waterwheel Heritage Park. Wellington Museums Trust. Wellington Museum. Wellington Zoo. Wellington Cable Car Museum. Wellington Tramway Museum. West Auckland Historical Society. Western Bay Museum. Westland Industrial Heritage Park. Wakaton Museum. Whanganui Collegiate School Museum and Archives. Whanganui Regional Museum. Whangarei Art Museum Te Manawa Toi. Whangaro County Museum and Archives Society Inc. Williams House and Garden. Woodville Pioneer Museum Society Inc. World of Wheels. Wrights Hill Fortress. Wyndham and District Historical Museum. Wyndham Park Heritage Centre. Yaldhurst Museum. Chapter 5. Lists of New Zealand museums at tourleader.nz/best-places-new-zealand/new-zealand-museums. The National Museum. Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarua, Cable Street, Wellington. National Museum Te Papa in Wellington. Regional Museums. Auckland Museum, Auckland Domain, Auckland. Rotorua Museum, Te Wairaranga o Te Arawa, in the historic Bath House, Government Gardens, Rotorua. Puke-Ariki Heritage, Knowledge and Information Centre, Modern Regional Museum, Ariki Street, New Plymouth. Canterbury Museum, Ralston Avenue, Christchurch. Otago Museum, Great King Street, Dunedin. Te Haikoi, Southern Journey, Palmerston Street, Riverton, Southland. Southland Museum and Art Gallery, with Tuatara enclosures, Gala Street, Invercargill. Far North Regional Museum, South Road, Kaitaia. Kiwi North, Whangarei Museum and Kiwi House Heritage Park, State Highway 14, west of Whangarei. Dargaville Museum, Collection of Maritime and Regional Focus, Mt Wesley Coast Road, Dargaville. Warkworth and District Museum and Perry Park, McKinney Road/Tudor Collins Drive, south of Warkworth. Devonport Museum, Vauxhall Road, Devonport, Auckland. Mercury Bay Regional Museum, The Esplanade, Waishanga. Waikato Museum Te Wairaranga o Waikato, Grantham Street, Hamilton. Raglan and District Museum, Wainui Road, Raglan. Te Awamutu Museum, Roche Street, Te Awamutu, Waikato. Te Aroha and Districts Museum, in an old bathhouse, Whittaker Street, Te Aroha, near Tornga. Wakaton Museum, Boone Street, Wakaton. Taraiti Museum, Stout Street, Gisborne. Opatiki Museum, Church Street, Opatiki. Moko Museum, State Highway 3, Moko. Aotea Utanganui Museum of South Taranaki, Egmont Street, Paita. Taupo Museum, Story Place, Taupo. MTG Hawke's Bay, Museum Theatre Gallery, Tennyson Street, Napier. Wairoa District Museum, Marine Parade, Wairoa. Puke-Ariki in New Plymouth Whanganui Regional Museum, Watt Street, Whanganui. Manawa Museum of Art, Science and History, Main Street, Palmerston North. Museum of Wellington City and Sea, Queen's Wharf, Wellington. Marlborough Provincial Museum, Arthur Baker Place, Blenheim. The Nelson Provincial Museum, Town Acre, Nelson. Motueka District Museum, High Street, Motueka. Golden Bay Museum and Gallery, Commercial Street, Takaka. Hokitika Museum, Tancred Street, Hokitika. Lakes District Museum, Buckingham Street, Arrowtown. Central Stories Museum and Art Gallery, Centennial Avenue, Alexandra.